2030 is a 15-year scheme created by the United Nations, and it's designed to sell global socialism as a form of poverty reduction.
I think the best description of Agenda 2030 was actually given by the head of the UN General Assembly when this was being negotiated. He called it the Master Plan for Humanity. And I think that was a really, really good term. I imagine God probably had a good chuckle about that. But they really do view it as this comprehensive plan that's going to govern every area of human life: law, environment, business, family, education, healthcare.
There's always been a group of people that thought they had a level of intelligence that was so unique that they needed to dominate the world. And the problem with that is they're always wrong. They always do something wrong, and it ends up in a disaster. And each one thinks that they have this ability to solve all the problems of humankind, and none of them do.
What they're trying to do is they're trying to give people the idea that we can fight global poverty, we can solve the problem of hunger, we can solve the problem of homelessness, and through these solutions, what they're really doing is they're setting up a form of global governance, world socialism, a centralized power outside of all national boundaries, bound up and unified and codified by the United Nations itself.
And so it really is a huge plan that aims to, in their words, transform every area of life. No one can be left behind. In other words, every person on the planet is expected to participate in this plan.
So it is a soft sell of globalization to the rest of the modern world.
History is truly at a turning point. We do not yet know the full extent and the systemic and structural changes which will happen. In times of crisis, the role of governments is more important and more relevant than ever. To go beyond crisis management and to look into constructive ways we can build our common future.
There are 17 goals of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They are part of the Agenda 2030.
It actually reminds me quite a bit of the old Soviet plans. You know, the Soviet communists would come up with these 5-year plans and 100-year plans, and the UN is doing something very, very similar.
So you have to remember the background to this is that back in 1992, they set up something called Agenda 21, where they were, again, trying to sell this idea that we can harmonize and hegemonize all people and have them all have, you know, a set of property where they will be able to sustain and develop their own families and have their own crops and have their own health. They'll be taken care of by the state, but they'll also be able to sustain their own lives.
You have Agenda 21, which is the agenda for the 21st century. And then they've broken it down into smaller segments. So from 2000 to 2015, we had the Millennium Development Goals. From 2015 to 2030, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals.
So they started working in the United Nations, and they created these 17 goals, now called the Sustainable Development Goals. These 17 goals are generating a blueprint for creating this world globalist society.
I think the world it will create is a sort of freakish hybrid of fascism, communism, technocracy, and ultimately global totalitarian government. If you go into the 17 different sustainable development goals that make up Agenda 2030, what becomes immediately apparent is that fulfilling a lot of these would require unlimited government power. And we're not just talking about national government power, as they make clear throughout the text of the agreement. We're talking about power at the international level.
Goal number 1 is to end poverty in all of its forms everywhere. Goal number 2 is to end hunger. Goal number 3 is ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all ages.
You can't take on these sort of enormous challenges like solve world hunger or solve poverty unless you have humanity effectively write a blank check to the United Nations. You can take as much of our money as you want. You can take as much of our power, our sovereignty as you want in order to supposedly solve these alleged problems. They market it as if it were an attempt to solve these alleged problems. I don't believe it is. I think it's a naked power grab. No totalitarian ever said, hey, I want to make you a slave. They always, it's for your own good, slaves. Of course I want to help you. Of course I want to give you food. So you have all these kinds of empty promises that we've seen over and over and over again over the last 100 years, from the National Socialists in Germany, the International Socialists in Soviet Union, Cuba, Cambodia, Mozambique, Angola, China, etc. But it always ends the same, with gulags, mass murder, starvation, and government control over everything.
For correctness, whether you believe that I have been diligent, that I have worked, that I have advocated for you in these years, that I have been decent, I have spent my time in service of my people. Now cast your vote. If yes, then stand up for me as I have stood up for you.
Goal number 4 is all about education. They want to make sure that everybody's got access to education at all levels for all stages. So free college, free public education, free daycare. Everything is going to be free and provided for by the state.
And I think education is probably the single most important front. Right now, they are indoctrinating about 80% of American children in government schools, similar numbers around the world. So education is really, in my view, the primary mechanism these evildoers are using to bring about this diabolical agenda. And that's not my opinion. You can just read their documents and you'll see that. If you go to Agenda 21, which I mentioned is the 100-year plan of the UN, the agenda for the 21st century, chapter number 36 deals exclusively with education. And they actually say right in the text of the agreement that it is indispensable for changing people's attitudes. They say it's got to give children the right attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors that will be consistent with sustainable development. They say it has to include spiritual education, which, by the way, they mean something very, very different than Christians have traditionally understood. And the same is true with Agenda 2030. If you look at goal number 4, it's dedicated exclusively to education, and it's designed to sound nice and non-threatening. But if you just dig right under the surface, you see very clearly what they're doing. They say that by 2030, all learners, right, there will be no exceptions, all learners will be so indoctrinated, they won't just submit to this agenda. The term that the document actually uses, they'll promote sustainable development, gender equality, which is UN code for smash the patriarchy, destroy the nuclear family. They'll promote human rights, which in UN speak is quite literally the opposite of what Americans have traditionally understood as human rights. Right? In America, our founding fathers said God gave us rights, the right to life, the right to liberty, etc., the right to property. When you look at the UN's own documents on human rights, it's exactly the opposite. Right? You look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Who gives you rights? Not God, but government, international agreements. And if government and international agreements gave you alleged rights, well, then, of course, they can take them away. And they spell that out. Article 29 says none of your rights and privileges may be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the UN. So the core of their effort to move humanity in this direction is the indoctrination of children. And so parents, I think, have an enormous responsibility here to protect their children from that indoctrination. They're moving very rapidly toward a globalized one-world education system that they tell you openly will be used to bring the next generation along with this agenda. So I think that's actually the most important battlefront. And I don't believe that running for school board is actually going to fix this problem. The system is systemically bad. From the very beginning, it was designed to turn the children away from God, turn the children away from love of their country, turn the children away from their parents and against their parents, and it's become very, very effective for that. So I do think the central battlefield is actually education, the minds of the next generation, and I do believe that they will either succeed or fail based on whether humanity allows their children to be indoctrinated into this.
Goal number 5 is to achieve gender equality and to empower all women and girls. Goal number 6 is to ensure access to water and sanitation for all. Goal number 7 is all about energy. They want to have access to affordable, reliable, sustainable energy in all of its forms. So gasoline, oil, electricity, everything.
As we move away from profit as really the motivator, we're moving into a whole new economic paradigm. And it actually has a lot in common with the technocratic ideas of the 1930s that were coming out of Columbia University, where energy rationing would kind of be the organizing principle. We see it expressed a little bit differently today in terms of what is your carbon footprint, what should your carbon budget be. So I think carbon footprint is the rationale for one of the biggest scams ever played on humanity in all of history.
We're developing, through technology, an ability for consumers to measure their own carbon footprint. Where are they traveling? How are they traveling? What are they eating? what are they consuming on the platform? So, individual carbon footprint tracker.
And it starts with the language, right? Carbon. We're not actually talking about carbon here. We're talking about carbon dioxide. People think of carbon as black and dirty and nasty. Carbon dioxide is invisible, and it's plant food. It's the gas of life, is what many scientists I've interviewed have described it as. But carbon has a really nasty connotation. And so when they say carbon footprint, starts with the assumption that there's something wrong with carbon dioxide. First of all, from a scientific perspective, that is utterly ridiculous. The planet is actually starving for more CO2, is what numerous leading experts on this, including Donald Trump's climate advisor, Dr. William Happer of Princeton University, have explained to me. And you can look back through the history, and what you'll find is that CO2 levels have been radically higher than they are today. In fact, farmers pump CO2 into their greenhouses because it makes the plants grow better, because the plants were designed to live in an environment with far more CO2 than we have today. Second of all, CO2 is really a trace gas. It's 0.04% of the atmosphere. The human contribution of that is a fraction of a fraction of it. In fact, of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, human emissions of CO2 make up a fraction of 1%. So the idea that this is the temperature knob for the planet is totally ridiculous. It's totally pseudoscientific. I'm amazed that they were able to persuade any sensible person to believe this. But from a totalitarian perspective, it is positively brilliant, because there's nothing that a human being can do that doesn't involve CO2 emissions. In fact, we emit about 2 pounds of it every day as we breathe. And so literally everything you do, from turning on a light switch to turning on your car to exhaling, even dying, right? When you die, your body decomposes and releases CO2. Everything you do releases CO2. And so if these evildoers can convince humanity that carbon dioxide is pollution, and of course global problems require global solutions, so if they can convince us that CO2 is a pollutant and that it's a global problem, there's nothing then that would fall outside of their regulatory and taxation purview. So humanity needs to understand that this is an effort to control absolutely every area of life. And if they get their way, this will be the organizing principle of the economy. You get a carbon budget. You can have X carbon footprint for the month or for the year, and then you get to decide how you're going to carve that up. Maybe you'll take one plane ride every 5 years. Maybe you'll eat 2 steak dinners this month. Maybe you'll drive a car outside of your 15-minute city zone. But ultimately, it will be the limiting factor on everything we do. So it is a control mechanism, not a scientific idea. It's a total fraud. I think humanity must oppose it. But it's also one of the organizing principles behind Agenda 2030 and so much of what they're doing. If you look at what they're doing on the economic front, the government front, and the religious front, this climate crisis narrative is at the core of it. And so it's so dangerous, and it's so important that it be exposed.
Goal number 8 is all about economic growth and job opportunities. They want to make sure everybody's got a job, everybody's got access to jobs, that everybody's got access to economic development, but all of that development has parameters. Goal number 9 is all about innovative infrastructure. And you hear this coming out in like 15-minute cities where they say, we want to have an infrastructure that is sustainable and everything is going to be available within a 15-minute radius. But whenever you start thinking of the word sustainable, you have to think they're not really sustaining everything, they're containing people.
So with the assumption that CO2 is dangerous pollution, that it's bad for the planet, that it's going to make the planet hotter, comes the idea that we have to reduce the amount of CO2 that's emitted. And one of the ways that they have not just proposed, but they are moving forward on to limit CO2 emissions is by limiting the amount that people can move. And so they now have this concept, and it's already being executed. There are already places in the world that are deliberately and openly building what they're describing as 15-minute cities, including right here in Florida, right, where the hurricane hit the west coast of Florida. And even the mainstream news was reporting that some of these towns and cities that were hit were going to rebuild with the model of a 15-minute city. So the idea is everything you need in your day-to-day life would be within a 15-minute radius of your dwelling place. So your grocery store, your doctor, your dentist, your barber, your entertainment, your park, everything you need is going to be within this little 15-minute radius from your house. And if you want to go outside of that, well, then you're going to have to either ask permission or use some of your carbon credits or have some very, very good reason. So this is really like an internal passport system, kind of like what we saw in some of the worst tyrannies of the last century, where the movement of people, even within their own countries, was strictly controlled. And I think that's what we're headed toward if we don't stop these people. Again, under the pretext of climate change, which is a non-issue. I mean, climate has always changed. It will always change. Human emissions of CO2 are not causing any kind of catastrophe. But if you can convince enough people of this, then you can bring in really, really radical policy ideas like keeping everybody caged within a 15-minute city.
So in the past, it was like, let's do a war. Now it's like, let's dominate the world with climate change.
It's coercion. They don't want to tell you, we now have a law that says you're not allowed to go 15 minutes outside of the limits here. What they're going to say is, out of convenience, and because we want to be economically and environmentally friendly, we've got to make sure that you're not using over an allotted amount of fossil fuels, because then you're going to be hurting the environment. So we're going to say that if you want to go to Manhattan, or if you want to go to some other place outside of your 15-minute zone, you're going to have to pay, and you're going to have to pay a lot. And when you pay to get to those locations, well, that's going to be such a huge fee that it's going to take you a long time before you're able to pay for that again. If you use coercion, financial coercion, you say, you now have a financial incentive not to go someplace. Well, you're not going to go anywhere. Goal number 10 is about reducing inequality among countries. So you don't want to have an impoverished Africa and a wealthy America. You want to transfer that wealth. So it's all about redistributing that wealth so that everybody's got access to everything.
So they're moving the world toward a one world economic system. They're doing this quite out in the open today through the World Economic Forum, through the Agenda 2030, through the Bank for International Settlements. And you know, I don't think any of the previous labels adequately describes what we're moving toward. It's not exactly communism, and it's not exactly fascism. It's kind of a weird, freakish merger of the two. You know, in National Socialism in Nazi Germany, you could still have some private property. You could still own a factory, for example, as long as the factory was producing whatever Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists said it needed to produce. And it seems like the world that we're moving toward bears a lot of similarities with that. But if you had to pick a model, I would say probably communist China is the closest to the system they envision for the world. And if you look at communist China, it's not communist in the traditional sense of, you know, Marxism, in that you can still have private property on paper, you can still own an apartment, you can still own shares in a company, but there is a very real element of state control over the whole economy. If you look, for example, at the biggest companies on the Shanghai Stock Exchange, the overwhelming majority of them are majority owned by the Communist Chinese state. And so even though they don't entirely own the means of production, they still determine what will be produced, how it will be produced, very much like in Nazi Germany. And so they've taken some elements of markets, some elements of price signals and so on. I think because it's essential. I think they finally realized that without these basic mechanisms, you just destroy wealth so rapidly, you have to mooch off the United States or your whole society collapses. So they've taken some elements of the market, but try to subordinate that all to state power. And we now see different organizing principles, right? In the past, at least in free market economies, profit was primarily the organizing economic principle. So companies are in pursuit of profit for their owners, and they pursue profit by selling goods and services to consumers who want to buy them. So it worked out very well in that even a greedy person who just wanted to make a lot of money was constrained by the free market system into having to do something useful, whether that be cooking delicious food for somebody, or growing food for somebody, or cutting somebody's hair, or you know, all the different productive things that could be done in pursuit of profit. But the idea is the same. We've now reached a level where productivity in a free market is so enormous that they're trying to drastically reduce the standard of living, drastically rein in productivity, and trying to ration goods, services, energy, et cetera, to people right now under the guise of a carbon budget. And so I think that will kind of be, if these megalomaniacs get their way, that'll kind of be the organizing principle of the new economic system.
So the economic side of it, you have to understand that everything they're talking about with regard to agriculture, with regard to healthcare, with regard to equity and equality, education, all of those things fall in line with an economic system. Because what they're trying to do is create a socialized system where everybody is equal, everybody's basically putting all their cash into one big pot that then goes to pay out to sustain all those different things. They come together in that economic system. Now, what winds up happening in terms of fact, the centralized banks are the ones who are going to have that control. because you have to have the transfer of funds. How are we going to transfer the funds? Well, the banks are going to do it. The banks are the ones who are going to be reporting to those NGOs and those government agencies to let people know, here's where the resources are, so that we can carry over and give to those who need by taking from those who have.
And this is really laid out in parts of Agenda 2030. They talk about, for example, making fundamental changes in the way that goods and services are produced. That's not something that governments have the power to do in a free market system. In fact, Karl Marx was the one who proposed that governments ought to control the means of production. And that is essentially what they're talking about. When they talk about making fundamental changes in the way goods are produced, they're talking about government control of the means of production, clearly. When you go to goal number 10 and they talk about alleged inequality, and of course there is plenty of inequality, but what they're talking about here is wealth redistribution. They're talking about, and they say so explicitly, sharing the wealth, right? Well, you only share the wealth after taking it from those who have it or those who produced it and giving it to those who did not. And that is really clearly what's happening. And as they make clear in goal number 10, it's no longer just going to be limited to within countries. They actually said it's got to be within and among countries. So we're talking about global wealth redistribution, which first requires global wealth confiscation. And I think the image that they want to plant in people's minds is taking money from these evil, greedy, capitalist billionaires and giving it to hungry people who are being exploited and so on. But I think when you look at the people who actually run the UN, when you look at the people who come up with these documents, that's not what they mean at all. They're actually talking about seizing what remains of the wealth of the middle class, primarily in the Western world, and redistributing it to their kleptocratic buddies who are keeping the third world in dire poverty, or who have kept the third world in dire poverty for all these years. So this is not going to be some kind of utopia where poor people are suddenly going to be showered with money from the UN sky ferry. This is a world where everybody will be brought under control under the guise of bringing about these nebulous ideas like equality. And equality, they have learned, is a very effective organizing principle for tyranny. That's how they marketed communism to the Russians, to the Cubans, to the Angolans, to the Chinese. Now, how many people actually believe this stuff is hard to know, but at least enough to make it possible to tear down the old systems and bring in the new. And I think that's really very clearly what's happening through Agenda 2030, through the World Economic Forum's strategic partnership to bring in Agenda 2030, and then even through the kind of new morals and ethics that are being unveiled through the religions of the world that are actually very openly working with the UN and the UN affiliates through Religions for Peace, the Parliament of World Religions, etc.
Goal number 11 is to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And it's not entirely clear exactly what they mean by this or how they're going to achieve it.
Imagine using an EU-wide app to pay your bills, check in at an airport, rent a car, or upload a medical file. You log in with a unique lifelong ID number. To some, this probably sounds very convenient, much like traveling easily across borders with a digital COVID certificate that's recognized everywhere. To others, it's the stuff of nightmares, a digital prison of permanent surveillance and control. Either way, plans for an EU digital identity are coalescing, with a common toolbox expected to be unveiled this September.
But they use these words, safe, resilient, as buzzwords to kind of draw you in and make you think, oh, I want to be safe. I want things to be resilient. So they tell you these things, but they don't really tell you what it means or how it's going to work. Usually when you're talking about imposing a safe system, you're talking about martial law. You don't have anybody that's more safe than when they're on bubble wrap and locked in a cabinet somewhere and they can't get out. Goal number 12 is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Now, when you're talking about sustainable consumption, what you're saying is that you don't want to consume more than you have actually produced. So you want to have this balance between production and consumption. Well, if you're starting to consume more than you have, then either you have to increase your production or stop your consumption. Well, if this is a matter of food, where people are consuming food because they need food to live, and you're telling people you're not going to be allowed to eat anymore because we haven't produced enough grain for the year, it's, as Fulton J. Sheen used to say, it's the problem of too many heads and not enough hats. And they wind up cutting off some of the heads.
Well, there is a global effort involving Bill Gates and many others to take total control of the food supply. And they don't just want to take control of the food supply by owning all the land, which they do. In fact, if you go back to the very beginning of the Sustainable Development Movement, they always said we got to get land out of private hands. Back in the 1970s, when they had the Habitat 1 meeting in Vancouver, where they first started exploring this concept of sustainable development, they actually say in there, land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures of the market. It has to be controlled in the public interest. That's really like the foundation of communism, Marxism. We got to pry private property out of people's hands and put it in the hands of the government.
And this is the problem inherent within a group of people who think they're smart enough to control the whole world. You know, it's sort of like a godlike complex where this stuff comes from, are insane. So, you know, Bill Gates early on was like a hero of mine. Today I look at Bill Gates and I have no idea what he's doing. It seems very nefarious to me. I don't want to think that. I don't want to believe that about him because I use his technologies and I was a defender of technologies all the time. But now when I look about how he uses his money and how he's behind the scenes, it seems nefarious to me.
And so when it comes to the farmland, yes, they want to get it out of private hands, but there's even a whole nother layer to this in that they actually want to own the DNA of the food source. So you see now fiendish efforts to create freakish new DNA structures for not just our livestock, not just our crops, but even human beings. And for some very bizarre reason, the government in the United States and many other places has recognized the alleged legitimacy of patenting genetic code, if this genetic code is somehow novel. And so what they want to do is essentially take control of the entire global food supply using a combination of genetic engineering, control over all land, control of supply chains. And we're watching that process right now. There is a global war going on against independent farmers and independent ranchers, independent food producers of any kind, with the goal of destroying them, either bankrupting them or absorbing them into this giant global system through either buyouts or shutting them down and then picking up the assets at fire sale prices. And I first started noticing this over a decade ago. I saw what they were doing in South Africa. The president of South Africa was saying, bring me my machine gun, we're going to shoot all the Boers. Boer actually means farmer, even though it's been associated with the Boer people group, the Afrikaners. But that's weird. Why would the president of a country want to mass murder farmers? I mean, that sounds like a really dumb idea. Farmers produce the food that you need to survive. And then I saw in Brazil, the government was expelling huge numbers of farmers. Hundreds of thousands of hectares were being stolen from these farmers who'd been there in some cases hundreds of years through their families, under the guise of giving them back to Indians who supposedly owned them at one time. I got in touch with the Indians. Say, hey, the government says they're going to give you all this land. That's not our land. We don't even live in that kind of ecosystem. So that was a fraud. That was a fraud. And I saw them doing it in the United States. They were trying to kick ranchers and farmers off their land. Of course, the Bundy Ranch was a major one that got some public attention. Then they were doing it in Holland. They're doing it in Sri Lanka. They're doing it in China. In China, they don't even need an excuse. They just said, get off the land. We want to make the farms more efficient. So what we're seeing here is a global effort to destroy small and medium-sized independent producers of food and centralize control over the entire food supply, from the genetic material of the crops and the livestock all the way through to the distribution networks, through the Walmarts and the major corporations that will be in bed with government and distribute this in a tiny, tiny, tiny group of hands. It's hard to imagine something more dangerous than allowing a small group of psychopaths to entirely control the food supply, because ultimately that will give them control of the people. And I do believe that's what they're going for. So yeah, Bill Gates is buying huge amounts of farmland. I don't suspect it's just because it'll be a good financial investment, although it may be. I think ultimately the real goal is to totally control the food supply and thereby totally control the population.
It's interesting thinking about Bill Gates and his farmlands, because when you look at a billionaire like Bill Gates, and he goes and he starts buying up all sorts of pharmaceutical supplies, and he becomes the #1 holder in vaccines all over the world. He's also one of the largest suppliers of contraception. He's also one of the one who is buying up all this farmland. And the question is, well, why? To what end? And what you see is something that was very similar to what happened in the French Revolution. The Duc d'Orléans bought up all of the grain that was coming into Paris, and he took that grain and he had it dumped in the middle of a field, and he just let it rot. And what he did is he told the French peasants in Paris, that the king was the one who was squandering all of their bread, and then they circulated little pamphlets saying that Marie Antoinette had told them, well, if they're hungry, let them eat cake. It was a lie. She never said that, and it was the Duc d'Orléans who did it because he wanted to foment a revolution. How do you get people mad? You control the resources. You control the resources, you control their hearts and minds because you're controlling their bellies. So if people start to step out of line, you can take away their food. And you can say, you know what? We can start getting more food if you get with the program. Goal number 13 is all about combating climate change and all of the impacts related to climate change. Now, we have to remember, climate change is that great big bugaboo that has been the buzzword of the international globalist socialists since the 1970s, where they were talking about how, oh, we're going to have this problem of global freezing. A new ice age is going to cover the globe and everybody's going to be encased in ice and we won't have any food and everybody's going to starve. And then when temperatures started to rise in the 80s, oh, now it's global warming. We're not going to have an ice age, we're going to have global warming.
What's the consensus on parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere?
About 406 today.
Okay, 406. Are you aware?
350 being the level that scientists have said is danger.
Okay, are you aware? 350 is dangerous. Wow. Are you aware that since mammals have walked the planet, the average has been over 1,000 parts per million?
Yeah, but we weren't walking the planet. Let me just share with you that we now know that definitively at no point during the past 800,000 years has atmospheric CO2 been as high as it is today.
The reason you chose 800,000 years ago is because for 200 million years before that, it was greater than it is today.
When global warming didn't catch anybody's attention, they said, you know what, there's a hole in the ozone layer and everybody's going to die from skin cancer, and that hole in the ozone layer is being caused by carbon production that's going into the atmosphere. It turns out that it was actually just a natural hole in the ozone layer because there were no trees and there was no greenery in the area where that hole was. So they use these crises in order to sell you an idea. And they say, there's an urgent need here. There's something very serious going on. We have to come together to fight for that one unified thing, and that's how they get the power to do what they want to do to you. Goal number 14 is all about regulating the pathways in the seas, you know, your shipping lanes. It's about regulating the resources of the ocean. So you're talking about fish, you're talking about whales, you're talking about whatever the product is. They don't want you to have access to more than what they think ought to be allotted. The problem with that is that you first of all, you don't know what the resource depth is. The second problem is that you can't possibly control the tonnage unless you have some sort of computer system that controls all of the ships, all of them, meaning private vessels, commercial vessels, everything gets controlled. And that's what they're looking for. They don't care about the resources, they just want the control. Goal number 15 is a very interesting one because it has everything to do with biodiversity, and they want to make sure that they don't have deforestation or this desertification of the world, and they want to control everywhere in the world where they have these naturally preserved, beautiful territories, and this is part of the problem with the national park system. It inhibits development, and it stops any form of real production into areas where the resources truly are. Now, do we want areas that are preserved and pristine because we like the beauty of nature? Absolutely, there's nothing wrong with that. But when you create a globalist system that says we're going to preserve everything, what you wind up doing is concentrating populations in very tight areas so that the rest of the world is this one large natural preserve, and everybody lives in these megaplexes where you've got the entire eastern seaboard, it's one giant city, or you've got concentrations of populations in Central America, and nobody's allowed to go outside of these megaplexes. You can't have industry going out and building things, so you've got all the concentrated pollution that goes along with it. So they're creating corrals in order to contain humanity by saying, well, we want to preserve nature. Well, preserving nature is great. I'm all for it, but within reason. And if you're going to do this as a form of control, well, what we're talking about is controlling the populations. Goal number 16 is to promote just, peaceful, inclusive societies. Again, more buzzwords. People love justice. They want inclusivity. They want peace. But really, what does that mean? And what does it mean to be inclusive in a society that excludes something like Christianity? So if my faith tells me that I have to go and proselytize and try and draw people to Christ because what I'm trying to do is help souls attain salvation, but then that by doing so, I'm not being inclusive because, well, people who are in objective states of sin have to change their lifestyle. You have to come out of the sin in order to, live the life that is proper to salvation. So this inclusivity is about inhibiting Christian ideologies. It's all about controlling what you can say, who you can say it to, and when you can say it. Goal number 17 is kind of an all-encompassing goal. It's all about revitalizing the global partnership for sustainable development, it's a lofty term for establishing that globalist system. It's the systematization of that globalization.
So the banking system has been also one of the critical mechanisms for controlling humanity for quite a while now. In fact, going back over a century in the United States since the birth of the Federal Reserve System, and you can go back even earlier than that in not just American history, but world history, and you'll see that banking, credit, currency has been a critical mechanism for controlling people.
Well, I was an economic hitman, but my actual title was chief economist at a major international consulting firm. I had from 30 to 50 people working for me, depending on the situation. And my job was to identify countries, lower income countries, what we sometimes call developing or third world countries. I don't like those terms, but countries with resources that our corporations wanted, like oil. Or today it's more likely to be something like lithium or one of the minerals that's used in high tech. And in any case, we would identify a country that had these resources, and then we'd arrange a huge loan from what we call the Washington Consensus, which is essentially the World Bank, the Inter-American Development, the Asian Development Bank, the U.S. Treasury Department, the IMF, these bankers that do international business. We'd arrange a huge loan, but the money never actually went to the country. Instead, it went to our own corporations, usually big engineering firms like Bechtel, Halliburton, Brown and Root, Stone & Webster, companies that would make a lot of money off these contracts building infrastructure projects in the country. Things like electric power systems and industrial parks and highways, ports, airports, things that would help the few rich families in the country, the families that own the big businesses, the industries. But in fact, it was detrimental to most everybody else.
And now they're taking it to a whole new level. I would start off with let's look at the Federal Reserve. This is the biggest scam maybe in the last 100 years. They actually, through a private cartel of bankers, was able to convince Congress to give them total monopoly control of our currency and our credit. And like some kind of Soviet central planners are even supposed to determine what would be a good interest rate. I mean, how do these people know what the price of money should be? That's absolutely ridiculous. We know from every communist experiment that's ever happened that central planning of prices produces massive misallocations of capital. What did we think was going to happen if we let central planners centrally plan the price of money, which is the most important price in the entire economy? Of course, it was going to end in disaster. Then you add to that scam the fact that all currency comes into creation through debt. Right, so every dollar essentially that's in circulation, with a handful of very minor and insignificant exceptions like coins and the money that the Federal Reserve spends itself on its own goods and services, comes into circulation as debt. Well, the Federal Reserve creates a dollar and lends it to the government at interest, but they don't create the interest that's needed to pay back the dollar. And the commercial banks do this as well. It's a scam piled on top of a scam. And what that does is it results in a permanent debt trap where the debt can never be repaid. Even if all the debt were to be repaid, there would still be massive levels of outstanding debt because the interest was never created, and the economy would be sucked into a black hole and the bankers would end up owning everything. So for over 100 years, we've had a major problem with this here in the United States. Now they're taking it to the next level with this international system they're building, where you look at the central bank digital currencies, maybe the most powerful control mechanism ever devised by man. also being implemented under the guise of climate change, programmability, et cetera. And you combine that with this international blockchain ledger that the Bank for International Settlements has built. And they're doing this openly. Again, you can read their documents on it. You can listen to their speeches. This international blockchain ledger would basically tokenize every asset in the known universe. Every farm, every car, every house, every stock, every bond would become a digital token that lived on this international blockchain ledger. And the only way to interact with the blockchain ledger would be through central bank digital currencies and your national digital ID, which they're already saying will be tied to your credit score, will be tied to your personal data, almost certainly will be tied to your social credit score as they do in China. So this international system of banking, accounting, and currency that they are building is basically a giant slave system. One individual who exposed a lot of this over 50 years ago, I was actually Bill Clinton's mentor at Georgetown University, Carol Quigley, a historian. He described a global economic and political system that they were building, and he said the apex of the system would be the Bank for International Settlements. This is a very obscure bank. Very few people have heard of it. It's based in Basel, Switzerland. Very much an international organization beyond the reach of laws or law enforcement. And they are the ones who are coordinating not just the global movement towards central bank digital currencies, but also the move toward this global international blockchain. And Carol Quigley described the global system that they were building as being based on feudalism, which when you look at the World Economic Forum and their predictions that by 2030 you would own nothing, right? But you'd be happy. And then on the very next slide is you'll have to rent everything. Well, somebody's going to own stuff. It's just not going to be you, right? The common man will be stripped of his right to own property. And that, I believe, is all going to take place through this global blockchain currency and accounting system that is being imposed on us right now. So the evildoers have a variety of different mechanisms they use to bring national governments on board. It's really the old carrots and stick approach. We offer nicely first, hey, we'll give you big grants and, you'll get a big foreign aid budget. And we don't really care what you use it on. Build a nicer mansion, hire more police to protect your palace, do whatever you want. We'll give you a nice big chunk of money. We'll say it's to help the poor people in your country and it'll be really good for you, right? And all you got to do is, allow these new education standards to be imposed in your schools. All you got to do is put a UNESCO staffer in this education agency or whatever the issue is. The other alternative is, you're going to have a problem. We might put sanctions on you. We might say that you don't have democracy in your country. And, that would be really bad. You've seen what happened to Muammar Gaddafi, right? You wouldn't want that to happen to you, right? We're friends. We wouldn't want that for you. And so it's really just the old-fashioned carrots and sticks. We could do this the nice way. We'll give you money. We'll tell the whole world what a great leader you are and how you love democracy and how you really care about the children and how you're a strong ally. If you need any help, we'll back you up. Or we'll paint you as a monster who needs to be removed and overthrown. Maybe we'll have a color revolution in your country. Maybe we'll cut off your finances. Maybe we'll take it a step further and actually kill you. So these are the mechanisms that they use. And that's how they've been able to get so many of these national governments on board with this agenda. And we saw some of this through like the WikiLeaks when they were trying to get governments on board with the climate change agenda. Right? The diplomats were offering the government of the Maldives all kinds of huge spending packages. We're going to dig you a deep water port. But what in the world do you need a deep water port for if your island is supposedly going to be underwater in a few decades, right? So it's just a scam, but it's a combination of bribes and bullying. And when somebody resists, if it can get to the point where, what happened to Muammar Gaddafi, what happened to Assad in Syria, what happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Not that any of these guys were nice guys, but they were just guys who weren't fully on board with the plan. And so they were disposed of. And unfortunately, that's the reality of the world that we live in. That's not what you'll read in the fake media, because the fake media, of course, is in the hands of these evildoers. But for people who work in these fields, and I talked to a lot of people that work at the UN, a lot of people who work in the government. This really is how things get done. You offer them a lot of money and a lot of prestige. If they won't take it, you destroy them.
In that case, I go into the office of the president or the minister of finance and I say, I'm going to make you two offers. Now, I didn't actually carry a gun, but these guys, they knew that the people were right behind me who did carry guns, the jackals, who could either assassinate them or create coups that would overthrow them. You've got a choice here. You can take what I've got in this hand, which is a few $100 million for you and your family, or what I got in this hand, which is a gun.
What makes a secret society secret isn't that no one knows about it, but what goes on inside. Big part of the initiation is always you swearing, cross my heart and hope to die if you ever betray any of the secrets of the organization.
What are these world leaders doing, behaving in such a nefarious way?